Hello there! In this tutorial, we are going to be creating an animated button in Pygame. And unfortunately, creating a button in Pygame is more complicated than it really should be. But in this tutorial, I cover a couple of important bits. For example, how to create an elevated animation, how to make sure the button only triggers once, and how to set up the entire thing. So let's start with the logic of how this button is going to work. And in here, we have three major components that we need to understand. The first one is the text, the second one is the top rect, and the third one is the bottom rect. And let's go through them one by one. The text is literally just a string that we put on top of the button, so this one really doesn't do all that much. Then the top rect is basically the top part of the button, and this one is going to carry a ton of logic. I'll cover that in just a bit. But in the most basic sense, it's like the top color of the button. And finally, we have the bottom rect. This is also going to be a rectangle. And this one is, well, if you had an actual button, it would be the side. So this one is essentially there to show the elevation of the button. It really doesn't do all that much else. So these will be the three things we can actually see, and we're going to draw them in just a second. But now we have to cover two more important bits that are really important to make this work. Number one is we have to create a click logic, and number two is we have to be able to move the button. And to get the button click logic, all we really have to do is to check between a collision between the mouse and one of the two rectangles. And the one thing we really have to be careful here is that we are only triggering a click once. You're going to see in a second what that means. And to get the elevation logic, all we really have to do is to move the top rect a little bit up and then limit the bottom rect by a tiny bit. So with that, we have the basic logic. So let's get into the code and let's actually implement all of this. Alrighty, so here we have a super simple setup for Pygame. This would be the most basic setup, or almost the most basic setup you could go with. So if I run this code, all we really can see is, well, a white background. So just to go through it really quick, I am importing Pygame and sys at the top. Then I set up a couple of main things. So we have the Pygame display surface, we're setting up a caption here, and then we are creating a clock. So all of these should be very basic things. And the only thing that we really add towards this is a font. And this is just the basic font that Pygame has inbuilt. This is why we added none in here. And in my case, I have added a font size of 30, although you could have gone with a larger one. Just check with your own project to see what works for you. And then we have our game loop. And this one right now doesn't really do anything. The only substantial thing we do in here is to draw a white-ish background color. So all of this so far really, really easy. And nothing really happens here so far. So let's actually make something happen. And how I want to approach this is I want to create a class that I'm going to call button. It's going to need an init method that needs self and a couple more arguments. So let's go through them one by one. The first one, I just want to have a text. So this is just going to be a string. Then I want to have a width and a height, ideally spelled correctly. That tends to help. So those are the width and height of the button. And then we have a position. So the position is going to be an X and a Y position. So we can actually place the thing somewhere on the screen. So what we would be passing in here later on would be a tuple with these two coordinates. So yeah, you could organize this differently. It doesn't really matter. And this is the basic stuff we are going to need for now. So now let's start to define some basic points in here. First of all, I want to create the top rectangle, because this one is going to carry a ton of logic. And I want to put this into its own attribute. So self.toprect, and then I use pygame.rect to create a rectangle. And in here, we could approach the arguments in two different ways. We have to specify X, Y, width, and height. So this is usually how you specify it. Although, if you check the documentation, there's also another way that you could insert a tuple with the position and another tuple with the width and the height. And this is what I'm going to go for. So this is going to be slightly different from what I usually do, but not that much. And well, the reason for it is that this is much simpler because we already have a tuple with the position. It is literally just this bit here that we are passing in there. So very, very simple. Now, next up, we have to specify the width and the height of this rectangle. And this is also information that we have, because all we need are these 2 bits here, and we pass them in here. So yeah, also super simple stuff. So all I have to add in here is the width and the height of this rectangle. And height, that's how you spell that. Cool, so with that, we do have a rectangle. And there's one important thing I do want to emphasize here, that when we are using this position, we are placing the top left. So if I draw this, here's our rectangle that we just draw, and the point we are placing is this point up here. So just keep this in mind. You could change it, but I think this is generally the easiest way to place something. Although center would also not be a bad point, but we are placing this point. Just keep that in mind. All right, so with that, we have our top rectangle. Now, next up, I want to give this thing a color. And for this, I just declare another attribute. I call this self_top_color. And in here, I am just going to use a string with a hexadecimal value, which in my case is 475F77. And I got this from an artist online. But okay, so with that, we have our top rectangle. Next up, I want to create some text. So let's add another comment with text so we know what we're doing. And in here, we first have to create a surface with the text. So I want self text, let's call it surface. And this one, to render a text, we first need our GUI font. So GUI font, then I want render. And now in here, we are going to need 3 bits of information. First of all, we need the actual text. So this is the text that we have specified earlier in here. So this bit. Now, next up, we have to specify if this is supposed to be anti-aliased or not, which in my case, I do want to do because we are not using pixel art. And finally, we have to specify a color. And for that, again, I'm going to use a hexadecimal color. So FF, FF, and FF, and this is pure white. So a pure white text for our text surface. Cool, so now we have a surface, and to place it, I want to get another rectangle. So I'm going to call this text rect. And for that, all we want to do is to get the surface, the text surface, and then use get rect. And in here, we have to figure out where to place it. And well, let me illustrate this. So we know that this top rectangle is going to be this kind of rectangle. And when we have our text, all we want to do is to place this thing right in the center of it. And that's a bit of information that we can use very easily. So all we have to do is to specify the center here when we place this rectangle, and then get self top rectangle, and then get the center from that. So when we are getting this rectangle, we are picking this rectangle here at the top and just placing the center of one into the center of the other. That's really all we have to do. And with that, we have a basic setup for a button. So now let's actually draw the thing. And I called this draw. It's going to be another method that needs self. And in here, I just want to draw the top rectangle and the text itself. So let's start with the top rectangle. So for that, I need pygame.draw.rect. And in here, we first of all need our display surface. So this is going to be screen, which in turn is the display surface we have specified early on. That's all that's happening here. Next up, we have to create a color, and we already have a color. It is this top color up here. So we have to pass this in there. And next up, we need the actual rectangle we want to draw, which we also have. It's this top rectangle. So we want to pass this in here. And for now, this is all we need, although I am going to add a little bit towards this in just a second. Now with that covered, we have to display the text as well. And for that, we need screen.blit. Because now we are placing a surface. We are not drawing a rectangle. So this is why these two lines are different. And in here, we are going to need a text surface and a text rectangle. Both bits of information we already have. So I want self.textSurface and I want self.textRect. So with these 2 bits, we basically have all we need to draw this basic thing. So with all of that covered, let's actually create an instance of this button. So let's call this one button 1. And this button is just going to inherit button itself. And now in here, we have to specify a couple of things. First of all, the text itself. And for that, I'm just going to go with click me. But really, any text is fine here. Now for the width, I went with 200, and for the height, I went with 40. And finally, for the position, I want to place this thing roughly in the middle. So our entire surface is 500 by 500 pixels. So let's go with 200 and 250. And with that, we have created our basic button. Now all I want to do is to draw it by calling this method. So in our game loop, all I want to do is button 1 and draw it. And now let's run this, and we have click me. It doesn't do anything right now, but this we can work on in just a bit. But first of all, I want to style this a tiny bit, because right now it has very sharp corners. But instead, I want it to look more like this and have more rounded corners. So something like this. That was terrible drawing, I apologize. So let's actually work on that. And fortunately, our draw method can do this very easily. All we really have to do here is to specify a named argument called border radius. And this one is going to need an integer. And for this one, I want to go with 12. So now let's run this. And here we have some more rounded corners. Now the slightly annoying thing is that you can't see the pixels here quite a bit. So I guess you would have to play around with the border radius to make this look nicer. But I guess for now it's fine. And with that, we have the basics covered to just display a button. But well, it doesn't do anything right now. And that is going to be the next step we will work on, that we make this button clickable. And for that, really all we have to check is the collision between our mouse position and our top rectangle. And then once we have that, we want to run some code. And this is literally the basic logic that we have to run here. Now there's one complication that we do have to be aware of, that if we were to just check the collision and the mouse button press, then we would trigger this button multiple times, even though the user would only click it once. And this is something I'm going to demonstrate in just a second. It's a minor problem and we can fix it quite easily, but it is something to be aware of. But let's jump back into our code and let's have a look at this. So here I'm back in the button and I want to add another method that I called check click. Potentially not the greatest name, but well, it's fine. And the first thing I want to get in here is the mouse position. And I'm going to call this mouse pos. And to get the mouse position, all we need is pygame.mouse.get_pos. And with that, we would get the mouse position. So print mouse pos, and then in our drawing method, I want to call check click. And now if I run this, and you look at the terminal, you can see our mouse position. So if I go to the top left, it's going to be basically 0 and 0. If I go to the bottom right, we get 500 and 500. Okay, close enough. Oh, you will get 499 and 499 because we start at 0. So what I first want to do is to check if this mouse position is overlapping with this top rectangle. And all we need for that is if self.topRect is collide point with our mouse position. So all that collide point does is that it takes a rectangle and it checks if this rectangle is colliding with a single point. So this one has to be an X and a Y position, which fortunately we have. And if that is the case, for now, let's just check if this works. We want to print, let's call it overlap. And I am really bad at typing. Okay, so now if my mouse is hovering over the button, we get overlap. So that's a pretty good start. But now we don't just want to check an overlap, we also want to check if the mouse button was pressed. And this we can also check very easily. And this would be done with pygame.mouse.getPressed. And this one is going to return a tuple with 3 elements. And each of these elements is one of your buttons of the mouse. So the left mouse button, the middle mouse button, and the right mouse button. And let me actually print this thing just to demonstrate what it does. So now if I hover over the button, you can see false, false, and false. But if I click my mouse, you can see one true. If I click the other one, you can see the other true. And if I click my middle mouse button, you can see the middle true. And if I press all 3, you can see true, true, and true. So this is something that we can use. And in my case, all I really want is to get the index 0. So this would be the left mouse button. And then all we want to do in here is to use this in an if statement. So if my mouse is inside of this rectangle and if I'm pressing this button, then I want to do something. And in my case, I just want to print click. But in here, in an actual project, this obviously would be much more complicated, depending on what you would like to do. But here's actually the problem I talked about earlier, and let me demonstrate. So let's say you want to click this button and run code only once. However, if I click it, we are running this 6 times. And the problem here is that Pygame runs this code 60 times a second. So you think you might have pressed this down once really fast, but for Pygame, your reactions are incredibly slow. And what Pygame perceives is that you have pressed down the button for 6 frames of the game. So you would have run this code 6 times, which obviously we don't really want to do. So we have to add a little bit of logic here to only run this code if the button was released, which I think is the easiest way. And for that, we have to specify another attribute. And let me do this right at the top. So in here, I want to have a couple of, let's call it core attributes. And the first one is going to be self.pressed. And by default, this one is going to be false. And now in this code, we are going to set this self.pressed to true, because we indeed have pressed it. So this right now wouldn't really do anything. But what we can do now is if the player stops pressing the button, so if this one doesn't evaluate to true anymore, only then do we actually want to run the code. So in here, we want to print the click. But this by itself wouldn't really work, because we first have to check if self.pressed is actually true. And only then do we want to run this. And after it has run, we want to set self.pressed back to false. And now let's try this again. So I have the code, and now if I click it, it only runs once. And I can do this multiple times. It works pretty well. Cool. So let's go through the logic of what happens here. And I think let's do this step by step. So we start in step number 1. We get the mouse position. This one I think is super easy to do, so we don't really have to add it here. Next up, we check in this step here if our mouse position, so this bit here, is colliding with the top rectangle. So if we actually have our mouse on top of the button, which also I think is a very straightforward thing. Next up, we are checking if the player is pressing the mouse button. And if that is the case, we want to set self.pressed to true, so that we know the button was pressed, but it doesn't really matter how often it was pressed. It is always going to be set to true. But now we want to check if this condition is not true anymore, and this one here is true. So basically we want to check if the player has pressed the button, but is not pressing it anymore. So then this else statement is going to run. And in here, we're going to check if the player has pressed the button in the first place. So if this condition here was triggered. And only if that is the case, we are actually going to print our code and then set press to false again. So with this logic, we ensure that our button is only going to be pressed once. Or in other words, we are only going to run the code once the player releases the button. So with that, we have our basic button logic. And well, all that's really left to do is to add some visual elements to it to make it look a bit nicer. So this is going to involve 2 parts. Number 1, if the player is hovering with the mouse over the button, I want to change the color. And number 2 is I want to add the bottom part of this button, so that we can have a downward motion that simulates how a button press would work, which I think looks quite nice. And well, let's actually jump right into the code. I think doing this explains better than any kind of theory. So here we're back in our code, and let's start by adding the hover color. That I think is the easier part. And well, all we really have to do is down in our check click, we have to look for this part here, that if the mouse is hovering over the button. And if that is the case, I just want to change the self.top color to something else. And in my case, I'm using a hexadecimal value again, which in my case is D7 for B for B. You're going to see in a second what this one is going to look like. Actually, let's do it right now. So now if I run this, still looks the same, but now if I hover over this, it's going to be red. Now the problem is if I move outside of this button, the color stays the same. So to fix that, all we have to do is if this condition is not true anymore, I want to add another else statement. So if our mouse has left the button, and if that is the case, I want to return my self.topColor back to what it used to be. So the color we have specified earlier here. And well, that is literally all we have to do. So now let's try this again. And now I have a hover color. This one is very easy. And everything else still works the same. So this is quite nice. So with that, we are going to come to this slightly more complex part that I want to add the bottom part of the button. So we are simulating the downward press. And for that, we are going to need a couple of different elements. So first of all, when we create this button, I want to specify an elevation. And this is going to be how high the button is. So if I were to draw this, let's say this is the top part of our button, and this would be the sides of the button, then the elevation is going to be how high this bit here is going to be. This is a number you really don't want to make too large. In my case, I went with something like 6. If you make this number too large, this is going to look very, very strange. So this is the first element we are going to need. And when I create the core attributes, I want to get myself elevation is going to be elevation. But here's going to be the problem, that when I press the button, I want to set this elevation to 0. And after I have released the button, I want to set it back to what we have passed in here. Now the problem is, if we were to set this value to 0, we would lose the original value we have specified. So to fix that, I'm going to add a second, let's call it dynamic elevation. And this for now is just going to be elevation as well. But essentially what's going to happen is that when we actually move the button, we are only going to change this value. And then once the player has released the button, we are going to set this value back to this elevation. And that way, the elevation we specify early on in the code is not going to be lost. This should make a lot more sense in just a bit. And now there's one more bit of information that we are going to need. And here the problem is that I want to move this top rectangle slightly up in the code when the button is not being pressed, when it's elevated. So I want to move this thing up by a couple of pixels. But for that, I really want to keep the original Y position. And just to make it easier to work with, I'm going to specify this as its own attribute. So let's call this original Y position. But really all that is going to be is pos and 1. So the Y position we have inserted when we created the instance of this class. And all right, so with that, we have all the basic parts that we are going to need to make this button look fancy. Now, before I forget, when I create the instance of this button, I now also have to add the elevation. And in my case, I went with 6. And I would really recommend to not make it larger than that, because that would start to look very, very silly. But okay. So now we have all the basic elements we need. Although there's one more bit that we do require. And let me put it right below the top rectangle. Because we actually want to draw the bottom part of the button. So I've called this the bottom rectangle. And then here, all we need is self.bottom underscore rectangle or rect. And this one again is going to be pygame.rect. And for now, I'm going to place this in the exact same position as the top rectangle. But the position here doesn't actually matter all that much because we are going to change this in just a bit. All I really want to do is to create this rectangle in the first place because we are going to use it in just a second. But the actual dimension of position really doesn't matter all that much. For the X and the Y position, I do want to have the width, and for the height, for now, I just go with elevation. But again, this part really doesn't matter. Okay, and next up, I want to give this a color. So I call this bottom color. And in here, once again, we have one more hexadecimal color, which in this case is 354B5E. And alrighty, now we have finally finished the init part of this code. So let me minimize it, and then we don't have to worry about it anymore. And now we actually come to the interesting part, because when I want to draw all of this code, I want to specify the elevation logic. That's probably a good name. And here's how this entire thing is going to work. Before we draw this button here, we want to lift it up ever so slightly by whatever we specified in the elevation. So, well, all we have to do in here is to get our self.top rectangle and get its Y property. So we move it up and down. And I want to place this in the original Y position. So original Y position, but I don't just want to put it in that position. I want to subtract the elevation. So self.dynamic elevation. So minus this point here. And that way we are moving the button up ever so slightly before we draw it. Now, why have I done that? Well, the idea here is that this dynamic elevation we can change. By default, it's going to be 6 or whatever you specify. But if we were to press the button, we could change this value to 0 or to any other value, to be honest. So that we only elevate the button if we don't press the button. But if we do press a button, this value becomes 0. So the button isn't elevated anymore. And for now, let's just print this. And well, you can't really see anything. But what you can see now is that the text is slightly further down. And this happened because we moved up the button by itself by a couple of pixels. So we do know this is working, and everything else still works. So let's actually implement the rest of the logic for the button itself, and then we are going to fix the text. All I want to do is when the button is being pressed, so when we are in this bit here, then I want to get self and set the dynamic elevation back to 0. So now let's try this. And now we can see that our button is going to be moved down ever so slightly. The problem now is it stays down. So once we release it, it's not going to make a change. And that we can also fix very easily. When we go to this else statement and we move outside of the button, I want to get self.dynamic elevation is back to self.elevation. So this value is going to be 6, whatever we specified earlier, and this value right now is 0, and we're overwriting it. So now let's try this, and I click it, and once I leave it, the button goes back to where it used to be. So this one is already working quite well. Cool. Now next up, the text makes this whole thing look quite weird. So I want to update the text position as well. And for that, all we need is self.textRect, get the center again, and now move the center once again to the top rect.center. And this is pretty much the same logic that we have used in here, where we just take the center of the text and move it to the center of the top rectangle. So now when I do this, we can see that we are getting the down-click button. And I did just realize that this line should rather be in this else statement. That once we have stopped pressing the button down, now it should be in here. So now let's try this. And yeah, this feels much better. So we don't want to elevate the button once we leave with the mouse. We want to elevate it once we stop pressing the button. Sorry about that. So, all right, this does make much more sense. Although, actually, here's one problem. That if we were to press down this button, and now with the mouse button still being pressed, move outside of this, the button would have a slight bug. So I hope this makes sense. So if you follow along, try this yourself, keep the button pressed and move outside. Now there's nothing that triggers this button being moved up again. So as a matter of fact, we have to add this line of code to both sides, so that we're lifting up the button once the player stops pressing the button, or if the player moves the mouse outside of the button. So if we have both codes, we can either press the button, it comes up again, or we can move the button outside and it also moves again. So I hope that makes sense. Sorry, that was a little bit confusing. But all right, now we have finished that part. And now all we have to do is to actually visualize the bottom rect part. And well, this one is also actually not that difficult to do, because all we have to do here is to get our self.bottom rectangle. And now I want to specify its mid top. So let me just draw this thing really quick. So now here we have the button and we are moving this point. And now the question is, where do we want to move this point? And in my case, I want to move it to the exact position where our top rectangle has its top point. So we are moving the bottom rectangle exactly below the top rectangle. So right now, both buttons are right on top of each other. And to achieve that, all we have to do is to get our self.top rectangle and get mid-top again. So right now, these two buttons would be right on top of each other. However, now we can change a tiny bit to make all of this work. Because now I want to get my bottom rectangle again. And this time I want to change the height of this button. And all we're doing in here is when we get the red button, we are extending it ever so slightly downwards. And that way we are making it look like the button has a bottom bit. And that's really all that's happening here. And since we are doing that, the height we have specified up here really doesn't matter because we're overwriting it anyway. But we did have to specify it here because we are changing the rectangle here. So we did need to specify it earlier, but the actual height doesn't matter. So with that, all I have to do in here is to get self.toprect.height. So right now we're just copying the top rectangle. But what we want to do now is to get plus self.dynamic elevation. So effectively all we're doing is we are copying the top rectangle and adding a little bit of height at the bottom. And now if this number is 6, we have a bottom part, but if this number is 0, we don't have a bottom part. It's as straightforward as that. Now if we were to run this, we couldn't see it. And the simple reason is that we are not drawing this button. So let's do that. Again, I need pygame.draw.rect. I have to specify a screen. Then I have to specify a color, which fortunately I do have. And then I need a rectangle, which I also have. It's self.bottomRect. And now finally, I need a border radius, and this one I also have. And now let's try this. Now we have a bottom, and this bottom is defined by this dynamic elevation. So if I press the button and it goes to 0, the bottom part disappears. And if I unpress it, it goes away. So with that, we have a button that actually works really well. So I hope that was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.